Okay, let's unpack these sources. We have documents here that give us a really focused look at one place, Lake City, Minnesota.
That's right. We're pulling from, its local zoning regulations, a detailed housing needs analysis for the county around it, and some general info and history.
So the idea is to build a picture of the city from these pieces.
Exactly. Highlight its structure, its development rules, and maybe some of the community characteristics and challenges that pop up in the reports. We're letting these documents guide us.
Right. So let's start basic. Location. Where exactly is Lake City?
Okay, based on what we have here, Lake City is mainly in Wabasha County, Minnesota. Though, interestingly, a part of it does cross over into Goodhue County next door.
And geographically.
Its big feature is sitting right on Lake Pepin, which isn't, technically a separate lake, but a really wide, navigable part of the Mississippi River.
Okay. So a major waterway presence. And relative to, say, the Twin Cities.
It's about 65 miles southeast of Minneapolis-St. Paul, and it sits right where U.S. Highways 61 and 63 meet. So a key intersection.
Got it. Gives you a sense of scale. What about population size?
The 2020 census put it at 5,252 people.
Okay. And it has that distinctive claim to fame.
It does, yeah. Lake City is known as the birthplace of water skiing.
And its motto.
What you need when you need it.
There was also a historical note, wasn't there, about Lake Pepin's name?
Yes. Before it was Lake Pepin, one account mentions Father Louis Hennepin calling it Lac de Pleurs back in 1680.
Lake of Tears. What?
He apparently witnessed a really moving, sorrowful scene involving his Sioux captors near the lake, so that name stuck for a while in his records.
Wow. Lake of Tears. That adds a layer, doesn't it?
It certainly connects the place to, specific human moments deep in its past.
Okay, let's shift gears. From geography and history to how the city's actually built. The zoning document seems key here. How do these rules shape Lake City physically?
Well, the ordinance sets up different residential districts. You've got RD, LDR, MDR-TN, and HDR. These dictate what you can build and what kind of uses are allowed.
And it's not just houses.
No, definitely not. It's quite varied. The rules allow for different kinds of group living arrangements.
Like what?
Things like group homes, residential facilities, congregate housing, even uses like boarding houses, which they term semi-transparent accommodations. These are possibilities, often conditionally, within certain residential zones.
Interesting. What else besides residences?
Public and civic uses, too. You might find cemeteries, community service centers, schools, religious institutions. Again, depending on the specific district.
And maybe some limited commercial stuff mixed in.
Yes, exactly. Sometimes offices are permitted, or even things like commercial kennels or stables in the most rural residential zone. RD funeral homes pop up as possibilities in some districts.
Personal services, too.
Personal services in the higher density areas, yeah. And even neighborhood convenience stores are mentioned for the HDR district. It suggests they're not aiming for completely separate zones.
Okay, so that's the what. What about the how? The actual form. The zoning code usually gets really specific on dimensions.
Oh, it does. These rules control things like minimum lot width, maximum building height, and really importantly, how much of the lot can be covered by hard surfaces impervious coverage.
Right. Can you give us a feel for the range on those?
Sure. Lot width, for example. For a standard single-family home, it could range from a really wide 250 feet in the RD zone.
Wow. Okay.
Down to just 50 feet in the TN or HDR zones, which are designed for, townhouses and denser development.
Yeah.
Generally capped at 35 feet across most residential areas. But it does go up to 45 feet in that highest density HDR zone. And that impervious coverage metric is quite telling. It dictates how much land must remain permeable, like grass or gardens versus buildings and pavement.
How much variation is there?
A lot. It goes from just 10% coverage allowed in the lowest density RD zone. So lots of green space required, all the way up to 75% allowed in the HDR zone.
That 10% versus 75%, that really paints a picture of very different feeling neighborhoods.
Absolutely. And then you have setbacks, of course. How far buildings have to sit back from the property lines.
Front yard, side yards.
Exactly. Front setbacks might be 30 feet in lower density zones, maybe 20 feet in higher density ones. Side yard rules are there too, defining space between homes.
The code also digs into specific standards for different types of housing, not just single-family detached homes.
Yes. For single-family detached, there are minimums. They need to be at least 24 feet wide, 960 square feet in area, and crucially, built on a permanent foundation.
And for things like duplexes or townhouses, Multifamily buildings.
For those, the code actually brings in the city's history. It says new construction of these types should reflect the scale and character of Lake City's traditional buildings.
How do they define that?
It points specifically to the city's Historic Properties Survey report from 2005. So, developers need to consider things like front yard depth, building width and height proportions, roof pitch, the main materials used, facade details, even window and door placement to ensure a visual fit.
That's quite a specific link between history and new rules. Are there limits on adding these denser housing types into existing areas?
Yes, there's a notable limit. It states that no more than 1/4, 25% of the linear street frontage around an already developed block can be converted to townhouse or multifamily units.
So it kind of controls the pace or extent to densification on existing blocks.
Seems like it. It suggests a preference for more gradual change.
Parking always comes up in zoning. Anything specific here?
For multifamily buildings, yes. No parking is allowed in the front yard or in that space between the front wall of the building and the street.
And open space requirements for residents.
Multifamily projects need to provide common or private open space. It's 300 square feet per unit in the MDR and TN zones and 150 square feet per unit in the denser HDR zone.
What about smaller things on the lot? Garages, sheds, accessory structures.
The rule there is they should be similar or compatible with the main house. Design, materials, roof style, colors. It's about aesthetic consistency.
And just general stuff stored outside.
Generally, things like equipment or materials need to be inside a building or fully screened from view.
Exceptions.
Well, temporary stuff for construction or landscaping is allowed, but even that, if it's visible from the main street, has a 6-month limit before it needs to be screened or removed. It's pretty detailed control over the visual environment.
Okay, so the zoning gives us this really intricate, almost granular picture of the physical city. Let's switch to the housing analysis now. This looks at broader community needs, mostly in Goodhue County, but with points relevant to Lake City. What does it tell us about housing challenges?
Well, this report really highlights some significant barriers people face. When they surveyed clients getting housing help in the county, the #1 personal barrier was low income. 70% cited that.
70%. Wow. And systemically, from a community perspective.
The biggest issue, identified by 80% of those clients, was simply a lack of affordable housing options.
80%. So a huge gap between housing costs and what people earn.
That's the clear message. A fundamental mismatch.
Were there other common problems people ran into?
Yes. Bad credit history was the second most common barrier mentioned, both personally and systemically. Also things like financial emergencies, medical bills, issues with tenant screening related to criminal records, not enough transportation options, and just a general shortage of rental units overall.
Any other contributing factors mentioned?
Yes, lack of affordable daycare came up, and also having a household member with a disability. These added to the housing challenges.
Did the report look at projected demand for housing in Lake City specifically?
It did. It projected a need for about 136 for sale units in Lake City between 2020 and 2030.
Okay, so demand is there.
Yes, but here's a twist. The report also found that Lake City has an excess supply of existing single-family lots ready for building.
Wait, demand for units, but too many lots. How does that work?
Well, it suggests the need might not just be for more single-family lots, but perhaps for different types of housing, maybe smaller homes or units at lower price points that aren't being built. Or maybe the existing lots just aren't being developed for the right market segment.
Interesting disconnect. Did the analysis look at any specific groups, like veterans?
It did, using 2017 data for Goodhue County. It noted that a large share of veterans there are older, a big majority over 55. And it pointed out a higher unemployment rate for veterans in the workforce, 6.4%, compared to about 3.8% for the general civilian population at that time.
And resources for, say, homeless or at-risk populations.
The analysis observed that most of the specialized housing and support services for those groups in the wider region are concentrated in Red Wing.
Not so much in Lake City.
Right. It explicitly said there was almost no housing of that specialized type identified in other communities like Lake City, which could mean a resource gap outside the main regional hub.
Did the report suggest any specific housing types that are in demand?
Yes, it mentioned seeing demand for market rate rental townhomes.
Who would rent those?
The thought was they'd appeal to empty nesters looking to downsize but still rent, and maybe families new to the area who prefer renting first.
And what kind of features would make them attractive?
Things like larger units, modern amenities and unit laundry, Higher ceilings, an attached two-car garage was key, and having some green space as part of the development.
Any sense of potential rents?
They estimated maybe around $1,250 for two bedrooms, up to $1,500 for three bedrooms, based on the market at the time of the analysis.
Lastly, the report mentioned some existing county-level assistance programs.
Yeah, things like the Section 8 voucher program, public housing, help for first-time home buyers, and a specific county housing trust workforce housing assistance program. So there's a network trying to address these issues.
Okay, so let's try and connect these pieces. We have Lake City's very specific zoning rules controlling lot size, building style, density limits. And then we have this broader housing analysis showing major affordability gaps, demand for diverse housing, challenges for certain groups. What happens when you put those together?
Well, you see this complex dynamic, right? The zoning rules, especially things like the limit on converting block frontage to higher density, or the design rules tied to that historical survey, they directly shape what kind of new housing can realistically be built and where.
Which might make it tougher, or at least channel development in ways that don't directly address that affordability need or the demand for rental townhomes identified in the analysis.
Exactly. The rules aiming to preserve character or manage growth can also act as, potential hurdles to creating the varied and affordable housing stock the analysis suggests needed. That point about excess single-family lots but unmet demand for other types really highlights this tension. Zoning is a powerful tool, but it definitely channels the response to community needs.
And understanding these details, the rules and the needs assessments, why should you, the listener, care?
Because this gets you behind the scenes. These documents show the practical levers and pressures that determine what gets built, who can afford to live where, and what a place like Lake City actually feels like to live in. It's about the real-world impact of planning and market forces on people's lives.
So we've journeyed from Lake City's basic identity, its spot-on Lake Pepin, its water skiing history,
Right, through the nuts and bolts of its zoning code.
and into the broader housing needs and challenges in the surrounding area.
These sources together give us a much richer, more layered view than just, looking at a map. You see the specifics of design rules meeting the realities of housing affordability and population needs.
It definitely leaves you thinking about how communities like this evolve, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You look at these very detailed rules for how to build, and then you see the clear data on the need for different, more attainable housing. It makes you wonder about the balancing act. How does a place like Lake City navigate that tension between preserving its character and enabling the kinds of development needed to meet these documented needs for its future? That's the dynamic these sources really bring to light.